So I've had the most convoluted career known to man. And so what I'm trying not to do to talk to you about today are things that you already know in terms of the challenges in breastfeeding and all the things that go along with that. But to give you a sense of how my thought patterns have evolved around this issue on health disparities and where we are as a country and where the opportunities are. And I'll tell you that in the last couple of months, I've been involved in this issue. As you were just hearing, I used to run the health disparities agenda for the federal government for a number of years through multiple administrations. And for a long time, we always wrestled with, what can we do? And I always remember my mom was big on church. My mom used to be one of those people who went to church Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. And then on Saturday as well, but just for shorter time periods. And she would always say, the poor will always be with us. And I always take that kernel in my mind and looking at some of the recent data we have, and I'll tell you that we actually have opportunities now more than we ever had before in terms of making change and doing it in an evidence-based way. So when I used to lecture, I used to teach 3 classes. I teach 1 class now. Somebody taught me something before I started getting into lecture mode, is that people only remember 3 things when you talk, and you should remind them of the 3 things when you say them so that they actually remember it. Most students' attention spans start to wane after 15 minutes. You're all more mature and wiser, so I'll say 20 minutes. And so I don't expect you to either pay attention to everything or memorize everything, but I'll try and tell you what I think are the important points. All right, this is not the important point yet, but this is building up to it. So this first slide starts off with a little bit of the work that Robert Johnson has been doing, and we're building on a number of other foundations have been building on over the years. And this is idea of this concept that where you live determines how long you live. And so this is a macro picture looking at just kind of differences in life expectancy across the United States. Don't pay attention to that too much yet. This next couple of slides goes into more detail around when you start to drive this down, looking by community. And so we start off here looking at New Orleans and the difference in life expectancy in New Orleans going from the French Quarter up to about when you drive a couple of miles away. And you start to see some really interesting data points. And the snapshot here to understand is once you go from one particular zip code to the next, you can span an incredible amount of years in terms of life expectancy. Don't memorize that point yet. I'll tell you when we kind of get there. So sometimes when I give this talk, people say, well, this New Orleans, they've had challenges in terms of health disparities for a number of years. And we've seen that in a number of different places. So here's another snapshot looking at DC. And when you go across either the red line, green line, or whatever color you want to take, you go across different communities, you see a similar picture. So then I go to a place where I spent a lot of years, Boston. And you say, well, again, those were places where healthcare infrastructure, a number of years have been challenged, hospitals have been closing, hospitals have been opening, and all kinds of different things. So then I take you to where I do want you to start to remember now is Boston. And which is a pointer, a little green light, I think is a pointer. Hopefully it won't throw everything off. Okay, so it's not the pointer, but work with me. And so this is the city of Boston, where there are 3 of the best hospitals in the world. There's Massachusetts General Hospital, where I trained at, and also spent a number of years in terms of clinical practice. There's Beth Israel and Brigham, which are all kind of encapsulated around here. And sheiks get on planes. We used to have the Ellison floor where we would sneak up late at night on New Year's Eve to steal the food when we were interns and residents. Not steal, partake in the meals there because it was so good. And there are all these famous people. All right, so interesting enough. Now, when you look at the city of Boston, you can go from one particular neighborhood in Roxbury, and a neighborhood that I did some work on, in that community, and go across all the way over to Back Bay, which is close to the Massachusetts General Hospital, and you cross about a 30-year life expectancy. So what does this mean? Well, that 58.9 years in Roxbury is lower than the life expectancy in Haiti. Life expectancy in Haiti, according to WHO numbers, is about 60. It's lower than life expectancy in Iraq. And if you go by the 170-something countries that are represented in the WHO life expectancy table, this would fall about 181. So meaning that our communities, there are a lot of communities quite locally, and when I say local, local to the places where we have some of the most amazing points of care, where people are literally living in third world conditions. When I was in the federal government, I attended an ACGME meeting, and I heard an interesting statistic. And this was reflected when I went back into academics. And it was that if you poll medical students, 75% of medical students are interested in doing an international elective. 21% of medical students are interested in doing domestic community work. So what does it mean? It means that we are excited to get on a plane, get in a train, go in a little car, and get out in the desert and treat those folks who need it out there the most. But we're less excited when it's about stepping across or opening the doors or going in our own local neighborhoods. And I have a personal story that I often tell, which is reflective of some of the challenges that we all face sometimes when we're in clinical practice. And it's a story about a gentleman who would come in with repeated MIs. And we would stent him like you would never believe. We would do cool-off procedures. We would do all these wonderful things. And, we'd be in there. We'd be like, wow, this is great. I mean, I am just, gosh, we've done such good work for you, sir. Please go on and live longer. And then he would come back with another heart attack, and we'd do all these kind of great things, and we'd leave, and we'd feel really proud. And he'd come back in recurrent MIs. He had 3 stent thromboses and MIs subsequent to that within about a 1.5-year time period. And, we do all these great things that modern medicine could do. And then one day, my wife's parents were in town, and we went to the restaurant that my wife loves, and he was panhandling in front of the restaurant. And I thought to myself, of all the things we could have done to help this gentleman, beyond the millions of dollars we spent, addressing and thinking through some of the social dynamics that are actually impacting his life would have been the most powerful. And if you take all the data points, what I want you to remember is this concept of where you live and how long you live is such a defining concept, an uncomfortable concept in the United States, that it really gets to the heart of a lot of the disparities that you and others have been talking about for a long time. And the challenge is the closer the disparity. Nikki Laurie did a paper when she was at RAND, looking at people's comfort level with disparities. And I always forget the exact statistics, but it's something along these lines. If you ask physicians, what they think about disparities, something like 70-something% of physicians believe disparities exist at the national level. If you ask them how many believe disparities exist within their hospital system, that number drops a little bit less than 50%. If you ask them how much disparities exist within their own clinical practice, that number goes to the single digits, around 5 to 6 or 7%. And so what's the concept here? The idea here is that we all believe that somehow this is happening somewhere else, and we put a lot of effort into somewhere else, but it's very challenging to actually deal with these things locally and when it comes to your own overall practice. By the way, another way to look at the life expectancy numbers is this number in terms of differences is 58.9 is the life expectancy in the United States was at around 1914. So I like to say that some people in Roxbury and other communities like this are living 100 years in the past. This is not unique to Boston. You see similar numbers across most major urban areas. I grew up in Miami, Florida. And when people say that, they think that I spent every day I grew up in Jamaica, but the rest of my life was in Miami, Florida. And when people say Miami, Florida, they think, well, my gosh, you spent all your days on the beach, which I would like to do now, but didn't do then. But in fact, I grew up near an area called Opelika, which is a couple miles in, and has had and suffered a lot from the heyday of crack, cocaine, etc., in the 80s and 90s, and has one of the highest police brutality rates across the country in terms of police force challenges. And so I grew up in an area, part of Opelika called the Triangle. And any of you who are familiar with urban communities know that if you have a nickname for where you live, that's never a good sign. We were just talking about that earlier, exactly. That's never a good sign. And the thing to understand is, much like in Miami, much like in Boston, much like in New York City, much like in other places, where you live does matter. And as I've kind of evolved through kind of all these different educational areas and different kind of interesting things in life, what I've found is the higher we get intellectually, the more we like to distance ourselves from either responsibility or activity. And so I always like to start off with some of these grounding points. And if you don't remember anything else, remember that this concept of where you live trumps your genetic code, trumps any other kind of facet, particularly in the United States. So this is not a global phenomenon, actually, but this is something that's very unique to the United States. All right. So this is, I take no credit for these next couple of slides. David Williams, who's done some amazing work at Harvard School of Public Health, this is some of his data, and this is some interesting thought patterns growing on that concept of where you live. So this is looking at the segregation index. And this is some data that a number of folks have published and looking just at the index showing how many groups aggregate in one area compared to the other. And when David presented his data, and I kind of looked at it myself and then started reading some of the studies, I was amazed at just how the concept of segregation in the United States, and then tying it to what I just said, has persisted and is just now a part of how we live in the US. So to understand just how powerful it is, this is a segregation index in, I cannot figure out which is, that's right, good, that makes my life easy. Okay, so to the left is a segregation, exactly, I can do that. Right. To the left is the segregation index in South Africa. At the heyday, not even now, at the heyday of apartheid, right? And then this compares it to the segregation index of most of our major big cities. And pretty much it's self-explanatory if you understand just how segregated we live in a lot of these communities, including New York City, right? And so we're not comparing New York City, Detroit, to some other state. You're comparing it to South Africa in the heyday of apartheid, right? It's an interesting concept. Fast forward to some other stats that David produced and looked at, and I kind of grabbed from in terms of his idea. In 171 of the largest U.S. cities, there's not even one city where whites live in ecological equality to blacks. No city, no major city in the United States do we have a segregation index that in anywhere is comparable or even close to the 50 mark, which would be a wonderful thing if we were to achieve it. Now, I gave this talk once when I was giving grand rounds to one of our great medical institutions. And somebody brought up an interesting point, and he said, to what degree, the concept is, to what degree, as you kind of explain these things, Garth, is it our responsibility versus the legacy of all these different things that have occurred, including slavery and all the different things that have led to where we are today. And I'm going to get to that point. But one of the things I want, hopefully you remember, is that I do want to start off with saying that each and every one of us have a responsibility for these numbers as much as a politician does or anybody else, because of the different driving factors and the kind of behavioral things that go into all of this. So I'll get back to that in a second. All right. This slide leads to some of the interesting data around breastfeeding that you guys are going to talk about and that you all know more about. I'll show a snapshot of it in terms of disparities in African American communities. And the Annie Casey Foundation just published some other interesting research that's not here that is reflective of this. And basically what you need to understand here is even in the more affluent African American communities, they remain very highly segregated. In fact, some of the data that came out of the Annie Casey study showed that African Americans, when they go from earning $50,000 up to $100,000 a year, actually still live in very close proximity to the communities that they grew up in. And if you think about the fact that those communities define health outcomes, it explains a lot of the other kinds of data that I'm gonna show you in terms of the persistence around disparities, particularly in terms of maternal and child health outcomes throughout economies of scale. And it's kind of interesting because as I was reading the Annie Casey study, which I think was around last year, I was thinking to myself, I actually know of, that's how I know life. Most of the people I do know who actually move up in terms of earning potential because of a number of different factors do stay close to home. And there are some pluses and minuses to staying close to home. The biggest minus being that a lot of the infrastructure that may be close to home doesn't necessarily promote good health outcomes. What's interesting about this data is saying that it's actually very much unique to African American populations in the United States. And so that's not necessarily reflective of the Annie Casey study, but it's interesting. So this is data you all know, looking at the interestingly low numbers amongst African American women and breastfeeding. And the data also showing the particularly low numbers around socioeconomic conditions and breastfeeding. So I want you all know this. This is me preaching to the choir about breastfeeding numbers. But stick a pin as you kind of think through this, right? If you look at these numbers, and even if you look at it graphically, what you really look at and see here is that even in higher income African American populations, I'm going to scoot over here so you can see, that's here, right? The breastfeeding numbers are still particularly low, right? In fact, the breastfeeding numbers are still equivalent to the low income population in non-black communities. Does that make sense? So the idea here that this is just a matter of poverty doesn't actually fly. Now, here's two other interesting slides I'm going into that. And again, this part is not for you to remember. The one point I wanted you to remember is just the power of where you live in the United States. This is kind of an interesting slide. This is showing infant mortality, which is the rate at which kids die within the first year of life, which you all know in terms of that data, and showing that even amongst higher educated African American populations, the infant mortality rate is still higher than lower educated non-minority populations. So let me scoot over here to show you what I mean. So, black, higher educated population, come over here, and the number is still higher. Does that make sense? There's a study that I saw when I was in HHS that showed that that data was presented when I was at HHS by a group out in New Jersey, where they did a study of African American physicians, women who are physicians, and showed that the infant mortality rate among African American women physicians were still higher than Caucasian women who had not graduated high school. That is incredibly powerful, okay? This is just another graphical description of what I just showed you, and to show you this kind of unique concept as it pertains to mainly African American populations. And what you basically see is throughout all the higher years of education, again, this is repetitive because if you leave here and you forget, and as you eating lunch and you have something delicious, you're like, what did that guy talk about this morning again? What this guy was telling you was this very powerful concept of where you live and how that multiplies through all of these other disparities data. So again, looking at African American women who have gone through very high levels of education, right? And you follow this all the way across the board. And for people who didn't graduate high school, again, that number is still much higher. Interestingly enough, when if you look at the social data around high school graduation rate, graduating high school in the United States adds 7 years to your life. That's always a big bump, is whether you graduate high school or not. There's not other big bumps in terms of other data, but this concept that babies who infant mortality rate, and this idea of in third world countries where we measure and understand infant mortality rate, this idea that even when you achieve higher socioeconomic standing, earn more money, in fact, a lot more money, multifold compared to other parts of in terms of other subpopulations, that these infant mortality rates will still be so third world, isn't important. And this is from NCHS data going from the 1990s to the 2000s. Okay, so the idea here is that the social conditions in which people live by far dictate and dominate the kinds of lives they'll live and how long they'll live. And that this concept of how this plays out into the things that you're going to talk about today, there's a lot of good data that you know better than me, showing how a lot of these programs, including WIC programs, et cetera, especially in California, have worked to improve breastfeeding rates within African American communities and Hispanic communities. There's a lot of good data on these programmatic things. What I want to introduce into your discussion today is taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. And though some of these programmatic initiatives do improve the breastfeeding rate within some of these communities, especially locally, what if we started to think about some of the other kinds of things that actually improve lives and lead to these kids living longer beyond the first year of life? Does that make sense? So what are the kinds of things and kinds of factors that both drive that and both dictate and drive that? Okay. So these next couple of slides, do not remember, doze off a little bit. Now is where you can think about, check your phone, etc. This is where I always show folks that the idea that there's been a ton of effort to deal with disparities over the years. When I came to HHS in 2004, it was when I started taking over kind of all the disparity stuff. We realized that our efforts weren't necessarily that groundbreaking. And then after a couple of years, we took a look back and said, wow, there's been tons of efforts since 1985 when these things started being documented. And in fact, a lot of people articulate that the big thing that we're talking about with healthcare now, in terms of the Affordable Care Act and all of these different kinds of things, are driven by this concept we've had since at least the 1900s of how do we take care of health disparities, minority population. This is a slide showing you, man, we've got a bunch of bills been introduced, bunch of politicians done some stuff, all kinds of things happen. In fact, there's some data to show that we've also done some amazing research. 24,000 articles have been published on health disparities since the 1985 report. At least $2 to $4 billion each year, if you go by the NIH numbers in terms of research. And we've always been kind of struggling with this. A lot of folks think that the Affordable Care Act was the first time people ever talked about how do you take care of poor communities. And it's not. In fact, it's been a big struggle for us as a country dating back even before this, back to the 1890s. But this is just to give you some examples of different attempts and the way different presidents have tried to articulate this problem. Looking at Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt gave a great speech back in 1913, talking about how we need to take care of the poor and how we got to do all of these different things. Fast forward to kind of the FDR days, and then in the 1960s. And then in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson and all of these various attacks on the poor. And it was all around how do you get more health care to the poor. What's always fascinating to me are two things. In the 1960s, do you know who was the biggest opponent to Medicare back in the 1960s? American Medical Association, the physicians. And in fact, I have a tape that I always play just to kind of give you the kind of understanding of politics when I used to teach this class, the Intro to Health Policy class. And it would be a tape from an actor in 1964, an actor who would subsequently become governor afterwards. And he was paid by the American Medical Association. The actor was saying, if you implement Medicare, it'll be socialized medicine. Oh my goodness, I won't remember his exact words. Socialized medicine and healthcare will never be the same. That same actor, when he became president in 1982, said if we make any changes to Medicare, it is the backbone of the American healthcare system. We'll take 10 steps back. Same actor, same personality, 1964 to 1982. What it means to show you is not that he did anything wrong. In fact, what he said in 1982 was true. But what it does show you is that the political discourse of this fluctuates. So don't pay attention to that, but understand that there's a history around these challenges. And there are things that we've done. Many things have not worked over the years. In fact, one of the most impassioned speeches that I've heard about giving health care to the poor, and kind of one of the most interesting things done, was by Richard Nixon. So there's all kinds of interesting things in terms of the history of all of this. This is a slide I always give my students as well, freaking out about the ACA stuff. And I have slides that show you that the slides back in 1963 that were Medicare, are pretty much the same slides message we used in 2008 around the ACA, where we say, oh, it's going to be bad. Socialized medicine. Socialized medicine, we used to say that since the 1960s. It's just a nice word to say, and most people don't know what that means. They just say, oh, socialized medicine. And I don't know what it is, but it's bad. And we've been saying that for a long time, and it gets people excited. And so a lot of folks are like, oh, so who's going to adopt Medicaid? Medicaid expansion. Oh, my God, if they don't adopt Medicaid expansion, this through the Affordable Care Act, oh, my God, this whole thing's going to fall apart. I'm like, hey, calm down. We've been there before. In fact, when Medicaid was first signed into law in 1966, only 6 states originally participated. And it took a long time until 1982 when Arizona came on for Medicaid to become truly national. Please don't remember any of these stats. But the thing to remember is when we talk about these conversations about how you deal with the health care of poor individuals, though the problem has stayed the same. And it is neither Republican or Democrat, because some Republicans have given some of the deepest thought to some of these kinds of things. But we get caught up in moment by thinking somehow this moment in time is the defining moment in life, when a lot of this stuff, as my mom used to say, has happened many times before. She used to say, "You can't teach me anything I didn't see before," and then she would administer some punishment. But the truth of the matter is, as a lot of the stuff that's occurring now, we've all seen it before, and a lot of the rhetoric that politicians make, they may change them 10, 15, 20 years from now. So buying into the rhetoric is not the right strategic move. Does that make sense? Please don't remember again any of this. All right. Now, what I do want you to remember is a couple of things. I'm going through some slides because I'm going to run out of time. Oh, let me actually stop here and give you an interesting study that we did that was actually led by Betsy Shankman at the University of Florida, and I think is important in terms of understanding how we deal with some of these challenges around breastfeeding and meeting people where they are. So we did this study within the Texas Medicaid population. And we asked, and she asked, and we were part of the study, asked people who were dual eligibles about quality of care metrics. Now, one of the quality of care metrics that we all strive for is preventing hospital readmission. I mean, we think hospital readmission bad, must stop it. Well, when we were asking a lot of these folks, they're like, wait a second, what? You're trying to stop us from going back to the hospital? That's a place where I feel better. When I go there, Donna is going to greet me. When my kid has asthma, she's going to put him on a treatment. She's going to hug him. She's going to treat him really nicely. We're going to get better. And you're trying to stop me from coming back. And I'm going to come back in. So this is interesting, right? Because we are, as a system, have all of these thoughts about stopping hospital readmissions when, in fact, many people actually want to be readmitted. And it's interesting when you kind of think about it because hospitals are a great place. I hate it when I'm on call, but otherwise than that, it's a great place when you're feeling sick and you feel safe. In fact, Jeff Brenner, who some of you may know, who's been doing some interesting work about on hot spotting, has this really interesting thought that a lot of folks who come from unstable life situations gravitate to the penal system or hospital system because both places have structure and safety, and a hospital is actually a very structured place. And so when we did this study, one of the things we realized is that most of our quality measures that we think are important, other than some of the other basic ones like hemoglobin A1C, et cetera, people don't actually make sense to individuals, particularly low-income communities. Don't remember that point yet. I'm saving my 3 points to later. Okay, this study, now, this is what I do want you to remember. So this is a study that was published a couple of months ago in JAMA. And it got a lot of press in the New York Times, and everybody's been talking about it. And it's this idea that it's not just about being poor, but where you are in being poor that matters. And the take-home part of the study was it showed that in New York City, somebody who's from a low-income household actually lives as long as people from a middle-income community in New York City. And this was all, everybody's like, oh, hail to New York City. There was all this stuff. I turned on CBS News, and they were like, it shows that New York City is wonderful. Maybe. But what it also showed was that the similar thing was in Birmingham, Alabama, and places where you have interesting or strong components of social infrastructure and the way in which things are integrated. Please do remember this slide, because what this does show is that there is a potential solution to some of these problems. And again, going back to what my mom said, the poor may always be with us, but we can actually have the poor live as long as others. It doesn't have to be where poor communities have these low life expectancies. And this study had another number of this was the largest study. They did over 1 million and something, as some of you know this study, IRS data, and they compared outcome, your income to how long you would live. It's Chatty and the folks from, and David Cutter from Harvard. And it does show that if you put in strong infrastructure, again, if you kind of remember this, you put in strong infrastructure, specifically hyper-local strong infrastructure, people can live as long as they can and should be. So this is an interesting concept about combating the concept of poverty. Caveat to this data, meaning it started looking at individuals 40 years and beyond. And we know particularly in some minority communities living to 40 years, I know where I grew up, that was actually an achievement to get to that point. And so then once you live to 40, your life expectancy does actually look better past certain ages. But the idea here is that you can do that. So what would I want you to kind of have the takeaway message here? when we have conversations about how to improve some of these communities, I just told you none of it's going to be new. We're having it for at least literally 100 and something years at every level. Please don't pay attention to rhetoric because it has no meaning except for getting somebody elected, which may or may not have an impact on your life and career. More than likely will not. But what we should pay attention to is what is the evidence-based things that we know can and do work. And what this new set of data, there's another study I should quote, is what new set of data does show is that as leaders in our community, if we start to think about this in a certain way, we actually can improve the lives of low-income communities. Betsy Bradley from Yale published a paper in Health Affairs earlier this year that also showed that if you rank social infrastructure and social spending, the communities, whether rural or urban, that have the higher ranking on that have the more equivalent life expectancy. So it kind of goes along with kind of what we see here, meaning that we don't have to cure poverty, but we can build in the kinds of things that would have people live longer. So, all right. This is how we've started. So I run a foundation. I spend 80% of my time running a foundation, a smaller percentage of my time still trying to be a doctor. And one of the things we've started to say now is, okay, let's invest in the kinds of things we do now that work. And as a clinician, I always say if something doesn't make you live longer, then it's just fringes around the edges. So if something isn't having kids live more towards that first year of life or towards whatever the average life expectancy is, then it's process. And it's good process that is indicative of the outcome, but the outcome has to be years lived. So now that we know that these kinds of things factor in, I always throw in this slide. It's an old slide that is overused within a public health community that Frieden published back in 2010, and basically showing that where most of our interventions are, what I've been trained in and what I know how to clinically do is way up in the top. But the kinds of things that drive change are down the bottom. When Frieden published this in 2010, he was talking about driving change. We know now in 2016, it actually does save lives. And this is where when I started out the discussion to say that I think for the first time, we now know what are the kinds of things that might actually extend life expectancy within low-income communities. And it really goes not down to socioeconomic factors is a very nebulous term. What I would say is building local infrastructure and working with local leaders to be able to build that infrastructure. So we are spending a bunch of money on this, working with cities and counties with this thing that we're doing with the American Public Association and the National Association of County Officials. This is not to, nothing for you to remember. In fact, please forget this, but just to know that based on this, there are organizations such as ours, Robert Johnson, a whole bunch of people in the foundation world who are spending money on trying to improve health outcomes on a county level. And the reason we're doing this, and you're seeing the Kellogg Foundation is also doing this, particularly in Michigan. You're seeing Kresge Foundation doing this as well. A lot of these folks are doing this because, one, foundations, you have more flexibility in how you can spend. But two, again, we know now that building and contributing to local social infrastructure would make a difference. And so this leads to my third ask that I would say of many of you. I have a bunch of other slides left, but I pretty much know I'm going to start to lose you when I talk about digital health because sometimes it gets a little boring for me too. The third thing I would say to try to kind of remember, when you look at this concept of local infrastructure, and as we've started to work with folks, what we've realized is that many times there are poignant local leaders who build or contribute to local infrastructure on the ground. And it would be people who are either politicians in a community, a public health leader, a physician at a big academic medical center. You've seen some interesting things that Rush is doing in the community surrounding Chicago and some of those high crime areas. As bad as it sounds, it's rarely the people who live in these communities that have the power and the voice to leverage the change. It is people who have lovely gray hair like you, sir, that are indicative of the wealth of knowledge that you have. That actually, if you look at it, it's actually people like people in this room. And it's interesting because we go, well, it has to bubble up from the community. But what you see, especially when you look at a place like Chicago, is that people in the community, they do know of the problems. They just don't have either the connections or the resources to be able to leverage them. Does that make sense? And so what we start to see of the kinds of things that are creating change is when people at either big academic medical centers, which are most times the employers in a lot of these communities, when some really esteemed guy stands up and says, I'm not going to stand for this anymore. I got, you know what, you are accountable, Aetna, you're accountable, Rush, you're accountable, all this stuff, we're going to do some stuff together. That's actually a lot of kind of what we're seeing. And then they find and work with a lot of the folks who have been toiling in the fields in these local communities for a long time. And so the reason why I give these talks to people who, like yourselves, who are very accomplished, is that this is the world that you can potentially change. You can potentially not, which is also an option. But this is the world of potential change because it is the influencers who do actually leverage influence. It is not the non-influencers who somehow gain influence through some magical beans that we spread. It doesn't work that way. It is actually the people who have degrees behind their names and all those kinds of things who are making a difference in some of these local communities. So the third thing I wanted you to remember is that, so again, what I told you that place matters, big time in the United States. We now know that data shows that improving local infrastructure through local programs actually does extend people's lives. And the third thing I would say is what we do know is that although change is driven from the grassroots, people need people with influence to be able to impact, to be able to execute that change, because they just don't have either the resources, or they can't go to the head of the hospital and say, you know, I care about our community now, but the chief of medicine can, or the chief of whatever, the chief of pediatrics can. And all of those things. And that's what you start to see happen in terms of these local things that are happening. The next couple of slides is kind of a thing I have that I am talk a lot about lately. This you can definitely not pay attention to per se. And it's this idea of whether technology can also be a potential equalizer. And how I actually started to get to this is I have no technological savvy. In fact, I am technologically behind in many ways, personally. But an interesting thing happened when I was watching some of my nieces and nephews who were engaged in some of the local protesting, local political movements around police activity. And I always kind of stay away from that political stuff, but I'll tell you that for a lot of these low-income communities, the first and only time I got hit as a child, I got hit by my parents, was by a police officer. And so in a lot of low-income communities, these stories are not esoterical, and they didn't just start happening when the guy taped whoever the latest taping was, because that happened to me back in 1992, right? And what happened was a group of us were playing in a field, a group of cops ran by, and they were looking for someone, and they were like, you guys know who it is? And we're like, actually, we don't. We were just here, but we don't know. We're all scared. And then they just hit a bunch of us. And that's what happens. But there's no videotape for us to show. And so a lot of this stuff happens in communities all the time. But now there is. So why did I tell you that story that was way too personal? Is that digital tools are allowing a lot of young people to connect in a different way, particularly from these communities. And many times we have to figure out how we can use this as a way to influence health outcomes, to reach people, because it is actually a very, very powerful tool, and they're organizing politically around it. And I want to figure out how can we use it as a way to actually have people get some real-time health information. And it does show that particularly within African American communities, Latino communities, the rate of digital technology is being utilized at a higher percentage. And so there's all these different kinds of things that we as a foundation are investing in terms of using digital tools. But please don't pay attention to that. The concept here is just that there are different things nowadays that people can and do use to identify and leverage power and influence. And they're doing this now. The technology is being done through its way to get numbers together, numbers of people together, and to be able to expose problems that people have been living with for decades. And how to tie this to my last point that I wanted you to remember is it really does come down to influence and who are the influencers. Sometimes it takes 300 young people in a particular location to have the influence as one powerful executive at a whatever company that has influence in that particular area. And so all of this kind of comes together. So as you think through the challenges around breastfeeding, particularly as breastfeeding, its positive health outcomes for minority communities, the fact that it's been so underutilized within minority populations, even higher income African American women, think through the actual data that we know about what drives that, and think through the fact that for the first time, I would say, we now know through data that there is a way to actually have change and have these folks live longer. Cool? Thank you.
I'd like to invite you to comment, and when you go to the microphone back there, please introduce yourself and say where you're from. All right, I see our first candidate is Casey.
Hi,
Please.
I'm Casey. Oops, it's not on.
Is that on?
I can talk loud. Casey Hopefully this isn't being recorded. Casey Rose and Carol from Rochester. Hi, everybody. First of all, fascinating and wonderful and incredible what you've done and the energy and enthusiasm you bring to this work. One of the things I'm interested in the map, our take-home message with the map, is that they controlled for race. And I think that you were saying very particularly at the beginning that there are special and unique circumstances with the race question that needed to be addressed almost independent of the geographic.
Right.
Because if you think about the geographic question, I mean, there's so much of the discrimination and the microaggressions and the stress that comes from a childhood where you get hit for no reason by law enforcement who's supposed to be protecting you.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of that relationship between what we seem to know maybe about geography and environment and maybe what's being left out when you control for race?
Yeah, no, actually you raise a good point. And in fact, one of my criticisms of that study that got so much press is that, again, they controlled for race and they started, after age 40. So here's what I would say. I would say that, to your point, much of the recent data, we've controlled away for the significant things that that we know have impact in terms of whether these outcomes matter. But what I will say is that if you look at some of the stuff that Peter Bach and some folks published back in the early 2000s, they showed that because of this clustering of where minority, particularly African American individuals live, most minority African Americans get their health care from 156 hospitals in the United States. It's a very small number, right? It's kind of interesting. And most of those hospitals cluster along two kind of geographic points, a lot of it in the southeastern part of the United States. And what they showed was that the quality of care there is particularly substandard and the social challenges are on a particular substandard. And they did not, and that was when they were focusing on race. And what I think you see from that is that a lot of the communities where those hospitals are located are a lot of the communities where in Chetty's study showed that the poor infrastructure was not there in terms of poor communities. So if you non-scientifically look at two different things, you can make some inferences. But I think you raise a very good point, which is if you are scientific and just look at the data that we have right now, we have controlled away for things that I think might have a particularly significant impact. So my point is, I think you're right in that it is a challenge. And I haven't seen any data that, hopefully this will evolve over time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Dr. Applegate, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, this is Mary. I'm Mary Applegate from Albany, New York, and I have a comment that I was intrigued by the graph that shows for people over 40 how much of an impact good local infrastructure has. And it intrigued me because not too many decades ago, and probably still in the minds of an awful lot of people, the cause of these health disparities among races was attributed to the huge genetic differences that in fact don't exist between races. And that slide showed that in fact, especially for low income or for African American people, your zip code really matters more than your genetic code. So it's really putting that old assumption on its head.
Yeah, we have no data to show that, there's some cardiology data looking at V-heft and some stuff. We have no real data to show of a genetic dynamic in this. We know that 99 point whatever percent of us are all similar. And in fact, if you pull apart some of the very few genetic data studies that people point to, even some of that, you're like, well, look at those couple of papers compared to the millions of other papers we have. And so this idea that, somehow genetics plays a component only works now, and I'm glad this is not a bigger forum, only works in the pharmaceutical industry, where people are trying to get, Bidil and other drugs moved forward on a genetic basis. But we don't have any real strong data to show any serious genetic component in either outcomes or treatment right now.